Streamside Vegetation and its role in reducing pesticide loading to streams. This will be presented by Dr. Kelly Mclain, a senior natural resource scientist with the WSDA NRAS.
Hi there. I'm going to talk today about a project that we conducted in Whatcom County this summer, looking at streamside vegetation and how much of an effect it could have on reducing pesticide loading to streams during aerial pesticide applications. So a little bit about the group that I work in. The Natural Resources Assessment section at the Washington State Department of Agriculture has a dual goal of protecting endangered species and water quality while maintaining agricultural productivity. We do that in a variety of ways. We conduct research, collaborate with partners, do technical assistance and outreach, and also handle policy issues for the agency. And our main projects are ambient surface water monitoring. We actually do that up here in Whatcom County on Bertrand Creek, 2 locations for most of the growing season. We do pesticide use data collection throughout the state on on most of the major commodities grown. There are 300 commodities grown, so it's not every single one, but the big ones. And then we do agricultural land use mapping of every field throughout the state. That's an annual project, as well as special projects like the targeted monitoring study we're going to talk about today. So this was a really collaborative effort, and targeted monitoring was identified by the National Academy of Sciences in a couple of years ago as the type of monitoring data that they would consider using in biological opinions. So in that recommendation, we have all these ambient monitoring programs collecting really great data that's really beneficial to growers, but we wanted to try to design a targeted monitoring study as a pilot project. And so we sat down with the National Marine Fisheries pesticide biop staff. They happen to exist in Lacey, about 5 miles from our office, and they do all the national pesticide biological opinions. So we had unique, easy access to them. We sat down with them and said, you know, we really want to design a targeted monitoring study. What would be of interest going forward? And we were looking at the first 3 biological opinion chemicals. So that's malathion, chlorpyrifos, and diazinon, and trying to find out if there was a study that would fit. They said they were really interested in looking at some type of BMP or mitigation that was in place and how effective it was. And so we specifically identified Whatcom County. We had information about pesticide use practices and the new pest pressure that's come on with SWD. We knew that they were flying product on with helicopters on a number of farms, and that malathion was one of the 3 main tools identified to growers as a good tool to use for control. And there's a unique set of circumstances. We have a lot of really great vegetated streams, naturally vegetated streams in Whatcom County. We also have had a significant effort put in by Whatcom Conservation District to get hedgerows, native riparian plantings done along streams that don't have existing kind of native stands like we have, say, on the Bertrand. So in the fall of 2014, we partnered with National Marine Fisheries Service, or NOAA Fisheries. We partnered with EPA scientists in the EFED division of the Office of Pesticide Programs, Whatcom Conservation District, the Washington Red Raspberry Commission and Blueberry Commissions, agronomists at the Whatcom Farmers Co-op, aerial applicators, specifically Kyle Blackburn at Essential Flight Ops, and then the Spray Drift Issues Management Team, which is a team made up of senior scientists on spray drift from the major chemical companies. So the reason that we started this project in Whatcom County was because we were looking for opportunities for growers to get credits where voluntary efforts had been put in place that would protect the stream. And so hedgerows had been planted up here on a variety of farms. They're a much smaller footprint on the farm, and they're much more replicable. So almost any farmer, if they had a little bit of space, could put these in. We can't ask people to replicate 100 feet of tree line on, you know, like you have on Bertrand, because that's been existing there. It was farmed around. And so we were looking at an option that could be something farmers could actually plant and get buffer credit for. So hedgerows themselves tend to be very small, normally 3 rows of plantings 5 feet apart. You use early succession shrubs that grow very quickly and can outcompete reed canary grass. You need to do some herbicide maintenance to keep those plants alive long enough to outcompete the reed canary grass the first summer or two. And they have minimal encroachment on the cropping area. So if you have some space adjacent to the stream, you still have a room to get your equipment down, to maintain your rows, to harvest your crop, but they don't infringe upon most of the planted cropping area. The nice thing about hedgerows as well is that there's a variety of native species available that are not hosts for SWD. So, you know, blackberries and twinberry, those are things that are going to provide overwinter habitat for SWD. But there are a lot of other woody species that can be planted, red osier dogwood, Pacific ninebark, other things that grow in those streamside areas that are not natural hosts for SWD and therefore wouldn't be extra habitat for them. And the other nice thing about this is that you can tailor it to meet the needs and goals of any individual producer. So maybe on some farms, this is smaller. Maybe it's not 15 feet. Maybe it's a little bit smaller to meet the needs. Maybe the spacing is smaller. Maybe there's tighter plantings. It's pretty low cost to install, pretty low cost to maintain. It's maxed out at full capacity and full growth at 4 to 5 years versus, say, a crepe buffer that may be 7 years or longer. It does mean that you need to do less weed control in ditches and drainage, just because it shades out plants that would be growing in those areas. And then you also don't get sedimentation and erosion in your ditches, which means you need to dredge less often. So one of the reasons we saw this as a win for producers is that we're trying to identify if there are mitigation measures that can allow for continued use of malathion and some of these other biological opinion chemicals. And where plantings have already occurred or natural vegetation exists, say for farms in the Bertrand Creek watershed, you know, get credit and acknowledgement for having that mitigation in place already. It also allowed us to identify, you know, with Whatcom CD, if there were vegetation planting options that were low cost, quick growing, low maintenance needs. And as I said before, the goal being to get to a reduced set of no spray buffers or not having to follow the no spray buffer requirements at all. And that's actual language taken from a more recent biological opinion done on another chemical. It also allows us to move away from one-size-fits-all buffers. And the buffer conversation is much bigger than pesticides. It comes in on everything, nutrients, other types of runoff. And those range in, you know, from 50 feet to 300, 400, 500 feet, depending on the issue. So we're trying to get at data that can produce more of these prescriptive or these adaptive buffers versus prescriptive one-size-fits-all. And the other benefits that come from this are, you know, lower in-stream temperatures and reduced nutrient loading from runoff and erosion. So my coworker, Joel Demery, is going to talk a little bit about the study design and the results that have come out of the work we did this summer.
So when we were selecting the sites for this study, we needed both control and vegetated sites. We primarily used aerial imagery as well as GIS technology and field surveys to find these sites. And we selected streams or ditches with blueberries that were directly adjacent to the stream or the ditch on one or both sides. The control sites did not have any dense woody vegetation, whereas the vegetated sites that we chose did have dense woody vegetation alongside the bank that was between 4 and 10 meters wide on each side. We monitor applications at 2 control sites and 3 vegetated sites, 2 of which were hedgerow sites and 1 of them had natural vegetation on it. We monitored a total of 8 aerial applications of malathion, 4 on our control sites and 4 on our vegetated sites. We collected site-specific and event-specific data. We also collected stream and vegetation characteristics before the application, as well as the weather conditions at the time of the application. So our sites were divided into 6 equally spaced transects. We measured the in-stream geometry, the shading, what type of habitat there was for fish, as well as we took general water chemistry measurements at the sites. This was, again, before the application. We also took a look at the vegetation. We measured the height, the width, the canopy coverage, as well as what species were present either in the hedgerow or at the one site that we did have natural vegetation there. So to evaluate the off-target movement of the chemicals, we installed depositional samplers at each of the transects at our sites. We installed one at the edge of the field, one at the edge of the vegetation, and one depositional sampler directly in the middle of the stream. And I'll get into the depositional samplers in just a second. And we also took, actually it was unfortunate because when we were designing the study, we didn't know that this summer would be the worst drought in Washington state history. So a lot of our sites that did have water in previous years did not have water in them this year. So it made it more difficult to get water samples, obviously. So at the sites that did not have flowing water, we took grab samples before and after the application. And at the sites with flowing water, we installed auto samplers upstream and downstream of the site. Upstream to try and capture any malathion that was flowing from any potential applications upstream, and downstream to try and capture the loading that was potentially occurring because of the application. And this part's a little confusing, but the auto samplers, they collected 100 milliliter subsamples of water every 6 minutes, and those were composed into 400 milliliter samples, and that was collected every 24 minutes. And the auto sampler collected 4 of those composite samples. So essentially, it sampled every 6 minutes for 96 minutes from the start of the application time. And we also installed weather stations adjacent to the fields, but not close enough to be affected by the helicopter. And that told us the wind speed, direction, temperature, humidity, and solar radiation. And that was logged every 30 seconds. So this is a map of one of our control sites. It's a single-sided site. Unknown ditch 2, or UD2 is what we called it. And Transect 6 through Transect 1, 6 being the most upstream of them. And this is UD1, or Unknown Ditch 1. And this was a double-sided blueberry site. So we had the ditch flowing through between 2 blueberry fields. And this is Fish Trap Creek. These are 2 berry fields on either side of the creek. And this is one of our vegetated sites that we studied. And this picture is an example of how we set up our depositional samplers along this is a double-sided control site right here. So on the sides, both on the far right and on the far left, we installed the depositional samplers at the height, average height of the berries. And then we also installed the depositional samplers at the edge of the vegetation. And on the right, you can see that there's 2 of these depositional samplers right next to each other. And that was just part of our QA protocol that we needed to do. That's just a field replicate. And it's hard to see, but also in the center of that grass, there's also a depositional sampler there as well. And these depositional samplers were composed, we used T-post, and then used PVC piping attached to foam blocks. And then we covered that with aluminum foil. And immediately before the application, we would install filter paper on top. We would pin them in. And that's just essentially like a glorified coffee filter. And so we'd put those on, and whatever drift that encountered the filter paper, it would capture it. And then immediately after the application, we would come and collect those, put them in jars, and ship them off to the lab. So this table shows the averages for the field and the vegetation measurements between the vegetated and control sites. A few things to point out is the control sites did have an almost 50% canopy, in-stream canopy coverage, and that was due to the grass in the ditches. Even though there's no dense woody vegetation, during the summer months, the reedy canary grass can still get 6, 7, 8 feet tall. So it still provides somewhat some canopy coverage. And this bar chart here shows how the distance from the field edge to the water, from our control to our vegetated, was quite different. So our control sites on the to the left, the distance from the field to the center of the stream were only 6 meters and 7.4 meters, where at our vegetated sites it was considerably larger. So that's something to take into account when we were taking a look at this data. So I know this table's kind of busy with information, but there's a few things that we really want to point out about this preliminary water data that we got back. So we did not have any concentrations found in the water that were above endangered species levels of concern. We had none. But the bolded numbers here, there's those 4 bolded numbers that you see, are very high concentrations actually. And we think that we can attribute that to being our 2-sided control site. Is what we called our worst case scenario site, where there was applications occurring on both sides of the ditch. And there's also standing water, so the malathion was essentially pooling up. The chemical had nowhere to go, so it was probably also breaking down a bit more slowly. But other than that site, they're all well below the levels of concern. So that is a good thing to see. So this bar chart shows the median malathion deposition at the field edge, vegetation edge, and in the water between the vegetated and the control sites. On the y-axis here, we have the concentration in micrograms per square meter. And at the field edge, we see similar concentrations of malathion between the control and vegetated, 3,100 to 3,500. But as we move away from the field closer to the water, we see significantly less malathion at the vegetation edge, and an even greater difference at the water edge. That's 1,400 to only 211 at the vegetation edge. And in the water, at the vegetated sites, on average, we only saw 39 micrograms per meter of malathion on our depositional samplers that are above the water. So that's really good to see. It shows that the vegetation is stopping the malathion from drifting over the water body. And so this scatter plot, on the x-axis here, we have the concentration on the depositional samplers over the water, and on the x-axis is the canopy cover percent. So all this scatter plot shows, and vegetated is in the blue, control is in the red, and all this scatter plot shows is that the more canopy cover that we saw, the lower the deposition of malathion, and the lower the canopy cover percent that we saw, the higher the deposition of malathion. So more canopy cover, less malathion. And finally, this bar chart shows the median percent of reduction from the field edge to the water. The percent reduction is on the y-axis. So at the control site, nearly half of what we saw at the field edge, we found in the water, which is not very good at all. And that was at the UD1 site. And at UD2, we saw a 75% reduction at the other control site. But at our 3 vegetated sites, we had between an 88 and a 99% reduction in malathion concentrations from the field edge to the water. And keep in mind that that's the vegetation at the hedgerow sites. That was only about 4 meters wide. And at the hedgerow sites, we saw a 94 and an 88% reduction. This means that for only between 3 and 5 years of growth, we can see a greater than 90% reduction in drift. So that's really good data to see. So we know that these hedgerows work, and this data provides an example of that. And so we're pleased to see that.
So a little bit about our future steps. We're doing in-depth data analysis right now. We're completing spatial analysis of our QA samples. We're comparing the data, especially for our control sites, to the AgDisp and AgDrift model. And we're doing a statistical analysis to assess the relationship between deposition, weather, and vegetation characteristics. Because as Joel mentioned, the data right now looks like the vegetation plays a role in reducing loading. We need to statistically quantify that. We do know that distance also plays a role. So we're looking to see what type of analysis we can do with our data that will help answer those questions as effectively as possible. The acknowledgements list for this project is really long. Obviously, we would not have been able to do this without blueberry producers' cooperation, allowing us onto their farms a month plus before treatments so that we could do vegetation assessments, as well as spend, middle of the night time at their farm, holiday time at their farm on the 4th of July, collecting samples in the early morning hours as the sun was coming up. There was a lot of setup on each of these sites for us to be able to take samples. We worked closely with Aaron Bagwell at Whatcom Farmers Co-op CHS. Kyle Blackburn and Essential Flight Ops LLC were huge partners. We wouldn't have been able to get this done without collaboration and cooperation between us, and tons of texting to make sure we were staying on top of the spray schedule as weather changed and needs changed. And then we collaborated and sent our research proposals and our QAPs to a ton of different people throughout the country that specialize in doing this type of research, to get feedback from them on how we could design a better study to get this type of information, with the eventual goal being that we have enough information to provide to NIMS and to EPA so that they can use this early in the process for working on the conditions and restrictions around malathion labeling in the future. And this is a flyover shot of our sites on Fish Trap Creek that were treated this summer. Any questions? Tim?
Hi, Callie. Thanks for the presentation. It's interesting data. It's kind of two questions. First of all, in a site like this, you've got tall woody vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
What is the likelihood that that's going to be roosting space for starlings, things like that, that may be additional pest species in berries? Then I had another question I'd like to ask.
I think every time the helicopter flies over almost anything, he probably scares up some birds. But obviously this is a tree-lined stream, so there's no treatment occurring right on the stream. He cuts off before he crossed over and does treatments. So it's very possible. And any site that has any type of kind of hosting species for SWD or other pests, native vegetation, there would be other things in the mix.
Second question regards, this is all aerial stuff. What would
Yes.
you expect to see reductions in ground applications of these same products if they're using ground application equipment?
Absolutely. We were looking at aerial applications simply because the buffer situation for aerial applications is much more dire. And given the fact that SWD is a Drosophila species that goes into, ripe fruit versus some of the other Drosophila species that you wouldn't find in the ripe fruit, the spray timing makes it very difficult on most blueberry fields for you to get in with ground equipment. You're going to damage rows when you go in with ground equipment to spray. So on some of the outer rows, I think certainly you could use ground equipment, but if you're going to be needing to spray a whole field, helicopter application is becoming more and more common. It's a more and more common need up here. So.
What are some long-term thoughts on maintaining these ditches? Once they're covered and grown up with trees, they also will silt in. Mm-hmm. And so in the 10 years down the road, it's no longer going to be a ditch. So what are we going to do then?
So my response to that would be, you can still get in and do maintenance. You do get less bank erosion with planted material along there than you would with no planted material. But you're right, there's going to be some sedimentation into the streams. I will say, and I can go back to the picture, that so these are the bottom one is a picture of one of our vegetated sites. It was extremely difficult. You'll see there's 2x4s bracketed across. This is about a 7-year-old hedgerow site. Our staff could not touch the bottom. There was a false bottom in this creek at this location. In order to actually, we had to engineer bridges that the staff could hold themselves up because it went up over their chest waders. And so we didn't see any places where there was significant sedimentation that was actually filling up the stream corridor. And this, like I said, this is 7-year-old, maybe 8 years old at the high end. So I think it'd be a wait and see, but there's certainly places where you can leave access points to get in. I mean, we had to kind of cut our way through to basically get in to get to the stream. But if you did need to get in and do maintenance in a ditch and not in an existing stream corridor like this one, then you could.
Okay,
Great.
thank you to the
Thank
presenters.
you very much. Oh, there's fact sheets in the back of the room about this project with the data on them that are a partnership fact sheet between us and NOAA Fisheries. Feel free to take a copy when you're signing up for your credits.